G3, the way it is phrased, since it makes a strong claim about proving the activity of an intelligent agent. I've already noted that events which are scientifically unexplainable allow for multiple explanations, not just intelligent activity, agent activity. However, if you rephrase G3 to something like statement G4, then I would be inclined to agree with it. Now, of the various philosophical arguments around ID, some of my biggest concerns are with statement G5, which is the close association, indeed the near equation, of the word design with the idea that biological complexity could not evolve. And I can illustrate my concern most simply with this bag of watch parts. Now, in the interest of truth of advertising, I should tell you that these are not watch parts. These are little bits and pieces and screws and wires I picked up around the lab. But please imagine with me, if you will, that I disassembled a watch and put all the parts in this bag. Now, I could shake this bag 24 hours a day for years and years, and the watch would never reassemble itself. Now, imagine that I have another bag of parts with the parts of a watch that is designed to self-assemble. Now, when I shake this bag, a little screw latches onto a little spring and they hold together. The battery hits the battery holder and snaps into place. All the pieces of the watch are constructed so that when two pieces that belong together collide in the right sort of trajectory, they hook together and stay hooked together. You shake this bag for an hour or so, and in the end, you'll have an entire working watch. Now, I don't know anybody who's invented it, but I can certainly imagine somebody could. Now, I present you with an ordinary watch and the watch which can self-assemble, and I ask you this question: which one is more cleverly designed? Now, I know how most people would answer. Now, my point here is not to try to prove that God creating life through evolution is somehow better than God creating life through miracles. My point, rather, is to say that self-assembly is not the opposite of design. Watches and biological life forms can be, in principle, be designed to self-assemble out of simpler component pieces. And this brings up a potential conflict, in my mind, between the fine-tuning argument for ID and the biological complexity argument for ID. The laws of nature are finely tuned not only for the existence of atoms and stars and planets, the laws of nature are finely tuned for atoms and stars and galaxies to self-assemble out of the fundamental particles produced by the Big Bang. And after nucleosynthesis and first-generation stars, the laws of nature are designed to bring about the self-assembly of heavier elements like carbon and oxygen and simple molecules, and planets with dry land and atmospheres and water oceans. This self-assembly of the physical forms of the universe is possible because of the fine-tuning of the laws of nature. And I believe that this is a powerful, intuitive argument in favor of the fundamental laws of nature being designed. But suppose the fine-tuning doesn't stop there. Suppose the laws of nature are fine-tuned also for the self-assembly of biological life and biological complexity. If the laws of nature are so exquisitely fine-tuned that life and complexity can self-assemble, should that be considered as evidence for design or evidence against design? Now, it seems to me it should be considered as evidence for design, but that's not how it's typically presented by advocates of ID. The way ID is typically presented by advocates of ID is that there's a choice. Either evolution is true or things were intelligently designed. Evolution or design, one or the other. Now, I know that some advocates of ID have made the point that this is a false choice. Some advocates of ID have made the following distinction. If biological complexity cannot evolve, we have detected evidence for intelligent agent action in biological history. However, if biological complexity can evolve, we have neither proved nor disproved design, we merely cannot unambiguously detect it. Okay, that's a good point. And I'm glad some people are making that point. But that point is not being heard by most audiences. Most audiences are hearing a simple message: evolution or design, one or the other. Listen to church members, school boards, scientists, the President of the United States. The message they have heard is evolution or design, one or the other. Philosophically, that's a flawed choice. Religiously, I think it's a dangerous message, and I urge everyone here, no matter where you stand on ID, to make the point that evolution or design is a false choice. And the reason I'm so passionate about that message is that there is unavoidably a religious dimension to ID. Now, I know that ID is often presented as if it could be separated from a religion, and I've already acknowledged that there are parts of ID which can be evaluated on their scientific and philosophical merits apart from religious considerations. But everybody, and I do mean everybody, knows that ID has religious implications. And advocates of ID themselves sometimes make theological arguments when talking to Christian audiences. Now, while I haven't used any direct quotations, I have briefly paraphrased on your handout some of those theological arguments under point H. These arguments are worthy of being debated and discussed on their theological merits. Some of them I would strongly oppose. Statement H5, on the other hand, I agree with. Now, I particularly like statement H6. I happen to disagree with H6. I do not think that good theology and hermeneutics make ID more likely to be true than evolutionary creation. And I'd love to have another 25 minutes to sort of present to you a cumulative scientific and philosophical and theological argument why I think evolutionary creation is true. But that's not why I'm here. Since I don't have that time, I will merely point out that I like the way H6 is phrased, because phrased that way, I think it could be a starting point for a spirited but friendly debate among Christian scholars. Before I finish, I should point out that opponents of ID also make scientific and philosophical and religious arguments, and some of their arguments are strong, and other of their arguments are flawed. If I had another 25 minutes, I could give you examples of good and bad arguments for theistic evolution, but that isn't why I was asked to talk. So, here's the conclusion. If ID is partly scientific, partly philosophical, partly theological, how can the debate over ID be conducted most productively? Well, to advocates of ID, I recommend the following. Don't pretend ID can be evaluated purely as science without consideration of religious implications. ID has religious applications, everyone knows it. So if somebody asks you, who is the designer? Don't try and be coy and say, I don't know, or it doesn't matter. Instead, answer, that's a philosophical and a religious question. I'll be happy to tell you my beliefs and the reason for my beliefs. However, can we also discuss the scientific arguments on their scientific merits? If somebody tells you that ID isn't scientific, reply by saying, yes, it's partly scientific and partly philosophical. But regardless of how you classify it, are the arguments themselves sound or unsound? Now, to opponents of ID, I would recommend the following. Don't play the demarcation game. That is, don't insist on definitions of science which try to wholly exclude ID. Don't insist that ID has to make specific empirical predictions in order to be scientific. It can be scientifically valid sometimes and useful sometimes to argue that certain events are unexplainable in terms of known natural laws. That's a valid thing to do in science. When advocates of ID make such scientific arguments, opponents of ID don't try and trap them or shift the terms of the debate by then slipping in, well, who is the designer? Instead, let's evaluate the scientific parts of ID on their scientific merits, and the philosophical parts of ID on their philosophical merits, and let's evaluate the religious parts of the ID on their religious merits. Thank you for your attention.